Spare the Kids Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America by Stacey Patton. Chapter 3 Extending the Master's Lash The Historical Roots of Whooping Children in Black Communities. One of the saddest untold stories in American history is the ways that its victims of racial oppression and violence have hurt the bodies of their own children in an effort to protect them from a hostile society. While physical punishment is so deeply rooted in the American way, of raising kids, history provides a clear explanation for why so many black people embrace this harsh form of discipline while falsely believing that whooping children is something uniquely black. Looking to the past can help us understand how and why this society, which intentionally chips away at the vitality of black life, continues to demand this vicious cycle of abuse against black children, even as it disproportionately criminalizes us for doing it. The fact is, white America has long derived power from assuring that black children are victims of physical, intellectual, psychological, and spiritual violence, and that the people raising them are complicit in their abuse. This is what white supremacy requires. Indeed, black folks have imported violence into our culture by embracing the idea that whooping our children will garner freedom and acceptance from white America and usher our communities into safety and prosperity. It has never worked. So then, how did this violent child rearing practice become so deeply implanted in our culture? Why do so many of us believe that if we spare the rod, then all hell will break loose, or that we will lose our black card or dishonor the legacy of our loving elders who whipped us so we wouldn't grow up to smoke crack, be a welfare queen, go to jail, or worse? We must journey through a few historical time periods to lay the foundation for understanding why whooping children is a practice that did not begin with us, but got etched into the DNA of our bodies, memory, and culture, even as white America gradually moves away from this kind of violence when it comes to their own children. Hitting and abusing children has a long history that's been a part of virtually every culture and society dating back to biblical times. The Bible itself is full of scripture sanctifying child abuse. Think about Abraham, who nearly sacrificed his only son as a test of faith in God. King Herod massacred innocent babies in a failed attempt to kill Jesus. Lot had drunken sex with his daughters. Young female sex abuse victims were required to marry their rapists. God sent two bears to murder 42 kids who made fun of Elijah's baldness. Let's not forget Psalm 137:9, which praises bashing the kids' heads of babies to prevent the rise of a new generation of Babylonians. For 2,000 years of European history, going all the way back to the Greeks, whose worldview can be seen within modern Christianity, adults deliberately exploited, tortured, raped, and killed their own children. Lloyd DeMause, the controversial psychologist and historian, wrote, "The history of childhood is a nightmare from which we have only begun to awaken. The further back in history one goes, the lower the level of child care, and the more likely children are to be killed, abandoned, beaten, terrorized, and sexually abused." For the most part, DeMause and other scholars have painted a dark and horrifying picture of childhood in Western societies. European parents beat their young with a cat o' nine tails, shovels, canes, iron rods, and sticks. Infanticide was common and unpunished due to po- poverty, the need to limit family size, or to eliminate political rivals, and because people believed that physically or mentally disabled children were the handiwork of the devil. During antiquity and the Middle Ages, about half of babies born were killed by their caretakers, and not just by poor parents. The ruling elites had just as high of rates of child killings. Children were burned, shaken, tossed about, and flung into rivers, trenches, and heaps of animal manure. They were also intentionally starved, castrated, thrown into fires by their parents as sacrifices to gods, cooked and eaten as part of fertility rites, fed poisons that plastered their insides, rolled in snow until they froze to death, sealed into walls and foundations of bridges and buildings, and abandoned on hillsides and roads where birds, dogs, and wild beasts scavenged and devoured unlikely waifs. In ancient Greece, a disobedient son could lose his tongue, eye, or fingers. Greek infants born with deformities were considered unfit to be raised, and thus killed in order to preserve ideal racial characteristics. Young boys and girls suffered routine sexual molestation by older men. A young person could be kept as a pet child for entertainment and pedophilic gratification, or sold into slavery or hard labor by a parent as payment for collateral or debts. Even as late as the 19th century, American medical journals reported regular findings of sexually transmitted diseases on children's anuses, genitals, and mouths when their parents had the disease. From royals to regular folks, centuries of Europeans grew up with severe beatings being a regular part of a child's life. This is of little surprise given the dominant beliefs. According to some historians, the modern version of childhood is a distinct and bound phase of life, one of innocence and insulation from violence, did not begin to significantly take root in Europe until the early 1600s. Before that, many children did not generally have the right to be free from violence. That right was granted only to adults, because adults define themselves as free and moral against the unfree, immoral, and criminal young. Countless diaries, letters, autobiographies, and medical reports detail routine mistreatment of children throughout history. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all European children suffered abuse, or that all European mothers and fathers from the past parented with hardened, sadistic hearts. Parents across different cultures and times, whether they were German or British, French or Greek, loved their children, displayed tenderness, worried about them, and showed interest in the stages of their development. Some even advocated for humane treatment of the young. At the same time, many European parents also lacked the capacity to respond to their children's developmental behaviors with empathy. As DeMouse explained, it is, of course, not love which the parent of the past have lacked, but rather the emotional maturity needed to see a child as a person separate from himself. Naturally, this harsh treatment of children, along with the desire for land, profit, fame, and religious zeal to civilize and convert the poisoned souls of native people to Christianity, bred a culture of adult violence, which drove conquest, colonization, slavery, and genocide. In fact, these practices were rationalized through seeing Africans and indigenous peoples as children whom they felt free to brutalize, rape, and kill. As a result, for white kids, a different worldview developed. By the 17th century, white children were slowly categorized as innocent, and therefore entitled to claim rights against the violent treatment that was endemic to childhood before that period. By the 19th century, with changing attitudes about children's welfare, beatings gradually decreased for white children, although it did not disappear. It turned into a milder form of punishment called spanking. For centuries, childhood for Europeans was a period of systemic violence, labor exploitation, enslavement, and sexual abuse. But when Europeans sought to enslave Africans, they imposed the category of child on them and modeled their racist system of exploiting black bodies on the long-standing ideologies of childhood and the brutal treatment of children in order to justify their enslavement. By the 17th century, a separate and unequal definition of childhood gained traction, with a childlike status encapsulating the permanent inferiority and savagery of blackness. In other words, white people began to recognize the vulnerability of their own children and had to rescue them, if only partially, from this unthinkable close proximity to blackness and the brutality of childhood. White adults began to reconceptualize white childhood as a newly developed space of innocence, promise, and security. As such, white children were imagined as partial adults who could gradually be guided out of savagery and into whiteness by being educated and perfected to their highest potential, and afforded special protections because they would mature into future beneficiaries of white civilization. Black slaves, on the other hand, even in adulthood, were by definition irredeemable. Wild animals and eternal children whose bodies were always ready sites of exploitation, control, and brutal treatment. The only people who are fully categorized as children today are also racialized. In other words, there's no such thing as a white child. There's only whiteness, which is always a form of privileged adulthood. Likewise, there is no such thing as a black adult. There's only blackness, which is always a form of dehumanized childhood. And so the bodies of underage and adult blacks occupy the same unprotected space of childhood and continue to be subjected to the same racist violence. In other words, black children are exempt from the protections young people should be granted to play, run, get dirty, and make mistakes. Their innocence is denied and negated, and as they are viewed and stereotyped as black adults, and they are treated accordingly in schools, public spaces, and sadly within their own families. Long before the first Europeans landed on this continent to build a model Christian nation, they had grown accustomed to doling out sexual and physical violence against their own children, whom they regarded as savages. That brutality cascaded across generations and continents and got transferred into other cultures through slavery and colonialism. While white people gradually began sparing their own children from brutality, it shouldn't be surprising then that traumatized black people in America eventually inherited their oppressors' violence and carried it forward in much the same way to their own children. When the Puritans sailed from Great Britain and arrived in the forests of New England in the early 1600s, they not only were survivors of religious persecution, but also a culture of profound child abuse that isn't part of our Thanksgiving narratives. This history of abuse may explain why they were also violent with one another, with indigenous communities, and with enslaved Africans. This group of separatists from the Church of England came to America to begin new lives and to establish new colonies and cultures. They sailed the ocean blue with their generationally inherited traumas, Christian and white supremacist worldviews, and a strong belief that children were potential threats to the social order. Beatings rather than nurturing parenting were needed in preparation for citizenship and salvation. Ambitious and self righteous in ways that would make Donald Trump proud, the Puritans brought disease, love of warfare, and a delusional belief that God had chosen them to inherit an already occupied land. They initially regarded the millions of indigenous peoples already living on this land as the lost children of God, who could be brought out of ignorance to benefit from a higher civilization. They believed they had been touched by God to create a city upon a hill founded on biblical teachings, this preordained manifest destiny of theirs and of other European settlers, and their descendants was to be achieved by stealing the continent and bringing the so called gifts of democracy, civilization, and Christianity to people of color. For these early colonialists, the New World was a violent and terrifying wilderness where they faced brutal life or death struggles. In their new environment, the Puritans endured harsh winters, horrible plagues, poor harvests, hunger, imperial warfare, frontier vigilantism, rape, child abuse, and the ever present hand of the Grim Reaper, which snatched the lives of the young and old alike. Indigenous peoples initially rescued white settlers from some of these calamities by feeding and teaching them how to use the land. But as the Puritans and other waves of European settlers acquired more experience in the New World, the Native Americans were seen more and more as obstacles standing in the way of progress and civilization. Heretics, witches, and those who had the nerve to question authority were also threats to Puritan visions of a godly life. Religious dissenters and sexual fornicators were publicly whipped, branded with hot irons, beheaded, hanged, and burned at the stake. So, despite stories of turkeys and funny hats, it shouldn't be surprising that a people who suffered such profound child abuse and witnessed public displays of sadism spent the next century engaging in genocidal terrorism that disseminated Native communities. If the Puritans' so called model Christian community was to succeed, everybody had to assume an assigned place within the family, church, and society. White male supremacy reigned, and people were expected to accept authority and rigidly define limitations of their positions in life. Individuals belonged to society, not to themselves, so it was crucial to have strict child rearing that produced orderly adults who respected authority and didn't breach the peace. The Puritans took the Bible literally, and they were serious about raising obedient kids. It was the sacred duty of parents to keep tight reins on them and teach them respect in order to save them from a life of sin and their souls from hellfire. Ruling children through shame and harsh punishment was necessary because their wicked behaviors could bring the wrath of God down upon the entire colony. They believed that harsh correction in this life by a parent was certainly nowhere near as bad as God's punishment. Spoiling children was discouraged, even during infancy, because, like their counterparts in Europe, the Puritans believed that children were born evil, with the stain of Adam's original sin on their souls, and so they had to be broken and civilized by beating the devil out of them when they misbehaved. I should know that this Christian concept that children were born innately wicked and shameful creatures was not part of the broad cultural thinking of Native Americans or West African societies before direct contact with Europeans and European Americans. In the 18th century, missionaries observed that Indian parents viewed their children as sacred gifts from the Creator. Hitting a child was atypical. One missionary wrote that Indian parents fostered independence by letting their children follow their own inclinations and do what they liked, and no one prevents them. Since the goal was to foster pride, independence, and courage, children were not hit, only reproved with gentle words. Indian parents feared that threats, coercion, and physical punishment would make children timid and submissive. Popular fundamentalist preachers of the era railed against sinful children who needed to be beaten into adulthood. Preachers told their congregations that children were sinful by nature, and they backed up their sermons by citing scriptures such as Proverbs 22:15. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far away. A fiery pilgrim minister, John Robinson's 1623 treatise of children and their education, urged parents to break the wills of their sons and daughters. Surely there is in all children, though not alike, a stubbornness and stoutness of mind arising from natural pride, which must be broken and beaten down. Better whipped than damned, warned the Reverend Cotton Mather, a Boston minister who was involved in the Salem witch trials during the 1690s. In a sermon on parenting, Mather's contemporary, the Reverend Benjamin Wadsworth, said of newborns, "Their hearts naturally are a mere nest, root, foundation of sin and wickedness, an evil treasure from whence proceed evil things. Their hearts are unspeakably wicked, estranged from God." Not surprisingly, there was little concern in colonial America about child maltreatment, which meant that many abused children went without protection. As children were considered property, their parents were allowed to treat them as they saw fit, and prosecutions for abuse were rare and mostly involved servants who beat their apprentices. There were few cases of children who were removed from their homes, not because of abuse, but because parents were not instilling proper religious training and a strong work ethic in their offspring. Unlike many Native American children who were not physically punished by their parents and were estranged to be autonomous, misbehaving Puritan kids were branded, sentenced to hard labor, tied to wooden posts, and beaten with whips, canes, switches, and paddles in the town center or outside the court, church, or schoolyard. Sometimes a child's head and hands are placed in a wooden pillory or stretch neck, where they were left standing in a bent position while passers-by teased them and threw trash and rotten food at them. In the 1640s, Connecticut and Massachusetts passed stubborn child laws, which required the death penalty for children over age 16 who disobeyed, cursed, or hit their parents, or denied that the Bible was the absolute word of God. This abusive treatment of white children was symptomatic of a broader culture of control and violence in a colonial America that exploited the many to produce wealth for the elite, proprietied class. How else to keep the anger and resentment of the masses in check but through coercion and sadistic, ritualistic forms of violence? In colonial America, punishment of indentured white servants and convicts included fines, imprisonment, banishment, tarring and feathering, servitude, whipping, pillaring, boring tongues with hot irons, cropping ears, and hanging. By the 1600s, the escalation of the British slave trade brought increasing numbers of Africans to the colonies. The enslavement of Africans on plantations in various parts of the South would dominate America's labor system. Torn from their homelands, those Africans were thrust into a new kind of violent culture, where they were introduced to the most barbaric dimensions of a European Christian worldview, and its practices that didn't come from an authentically spiritual place, but were designed to ensure the profitability of the slavery enterprise. Before our ancestors arrived in America, white men were slaughtering Indians and beating their servants, wives, and children. Slaves were brutally seasoned by overseers and masters, and soon our ancestors saw beating as an essential feature of child rearing and crucial to equipping children with the skills they would need to survive the harsh realities of plantation life. The European approach to child discipline was quite different from what was common in pre-colonial West African cultures. There's no one generalized pan-continental statement that can be made about child discipline practice in Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans during colonizations, after, or even today. That's because Africa is a vast continent with diverse religious practices and thousands of cultural traditions, ethnic groups, and languages. In pre-colonial Africa, Oral traditions, such as songs, tribal legends, proverbs, tales, and fables, were used in place of written records to relate important facets of history and to pass on information from one generation to the next. Before Europeans introduced Western education and literacy in order to more easily convert Africans to Christianity, families, clans, or tribes used games and riddles to teach children their heritage, good manners, respect for elders, the value of cooperations, and allegiance to ancestral spirits. Elders sometimes incorporated fear into the educational process by telling children if they disobeyed, they'd grow hair on their neck. Witches would get them, or the earth would open up and swallow them. Because Africans relied so heavily on oral traditions, we lack written historical documentation about the first hand experiences of growing up or parenting practices prior to the Atlantic slave trade and European colonization. We are left to rely heavily on the writings of European voyagers, missionaries, anthropologists, and ethnologists. But we must look at these accounts with a skeptical side eye, given how Europeans viewed Africans were colored by racist thinking, Eurocentric schooling, and paternalistic prejudices that saw Africans as a less advanced people who needed to be guided into the light of civilization. And of course, many of those European observations were used to legitimize the slave trade, colonialism, and missionary campaigns. Despite the lack of historical documentation on pre colonial African parenting practices, in 1941, the noted white anthropologist Melville Heroskowitz wrote the book titled The Myth of the Negro Past, in which he rejected the idea that black people adopted whooping kids from their slave masters. He claimed that whooping children was an integral part of child training in West Africa. When we turn to data from Negro cultures concerning whipping as a form of correction, we find a great deal of material to confirm as an assumption of historical relationship to New World practice. Herovitch wrote, in Dahomey and among the Yoruba, flogging of the order of severity almost unknown in Europe, except as a penal device, was the rule. Children were likewise flogged, not so severely, it is true, but severely in terms of comparable modes of applying this form of discipline in white societies. To back up his argument, Hirosowitz wrote that in Haiti, Guinea, Trinidad, and Jamaica, the cries of young boys and girls being whipped for misdeeds are heard even by the casual visitor. The right of any elder to whip an erring young member of his family is vested in all Haitians. For example, not only did Heroskowitz not cite historical sources for his claims, he was in fact that casual visitor during his anthropological work on the Dahomey and in parts of southern Nigeria in the 1930s and colonized communities where European contact, military aggression, labor exploitation, and the influence of Christianity and missionary schools had created profound cultural changes and altered the socialization of children and parenting traditions. Heroskowitz's argument that beating children was integral to West Africa may have been true after the arrival of Europeans, but that kind of punishment, if it existed, simply wasn't written or talked about by anyone else, even among early generations of European anthropologists and missionaries. The absence of information about child punishment does not prove that Africans never hit or abused children prior to contact with whites, but oral traditions make no mention of this kind of ritualistic violence. To get more sound answers about parenting practices back then, I turned to scholars who know better. One can be pretty sure that aggressive punishment against children in West Africa was unthinkable. The anthropologist Marie Last told me in a phone interview. Last, a professor emeritus at University College London and a foremost authority on pre-colonial West African societies, had studied historical and contemporary youth violence and cultures of punishment of northern Nigeria. To beat children was considered absurd, he said. You might want to be an adult for some infraction, but being a child diminished you because an adult is older and more powerful. Last said that according to historical records from the 19th century, even adult slaves in Nigeria are not mistreated with ritualistic whippings. If a slave consistently did something unacceptable, he was sold for export. Merely being sold was unpleasant for the slave. Children, in turn, could readily abandon their families if they were unjust in their behavior towards them. Parents exercised restraint when angry, and justice was really very important in these communities, Last said. Another expert, Heidi Nast, a professor of international studies at DePaul University, has written extensively about race and slavery. When I asked her about child rearing practices in West Africa prior to the Atlantic slave trade, she agreed that there was no singular way of parenting in those cultures. It depended on the geographical economy where those who were captured came from, she said. They were obtained from the forest where they were hunter gatherers. Nast said that Africans from those types of societies did not physically punish and bully their children. These were societies that emphasized farming and sharing. There was no property ownership or oppressive hierarchies. West African societies held children in a much higher regard than slave societies in the Atlantic world, which placed emphasis on black bodies as property, not human beings. In many West African societies, infant mortality was high. Because parents feared losing their children too early to death, they were highly valued as sacred. Unlike in Western societies that emphasized the innate wickedness of children, Africans believed that children, especially the youngest, came from the afterlife and led profoundly spiritual lives. Adults believed children held extraordinary mystical powers that could be harnessed through ritualistic practice for the good of the community. In parts of Nigeria and Cameroon and in Kijom societies, for example, children were believed to have power to mystically transform themselves into birds or fly invisibly through the air to meet interstitial beings. Children also had the power to play with the health of family members, and in some tribes, children were called grandmother, grandfather, auntie, uncle, or some other honorific because they were believed to be a reincarnated ancestor with strong ties to the spirit world, which granted the child a certain level of respect at birth. In European culture, boys and girls were sometimes given the names Babatunde, father has returned, and Yeyetunde, mother has returned. I went to school with a girl named Yetunde. It was believed that coercion and hitting a child could scare off their soul. In the non Muslim Hasua speaking culture in northeastern Nigeria, children were considered full members of the house as soon as they were weaned. The Bang people of d'Ivoire believed that because children have a fragile hold on life, parents should make earthly life so comfortable and appealing for them so they would not be tempted to return to another spiritual realm. I'm not trying to romanticize childhood in West Africa or assert that it was completely free of violence. Children were indeed mistreated in ways that we in the West would regard as abusive. In some cultures, children were regarded as beasts and monsters. In Yoruban and Igbo culture, for example, twins were associated with witches and dangerous immorality. Twins had special powers that could be dangerous and so sometimes were killed to prevent them from wreaking havoc on the community. In pre colonial Logos, children were sacrificed at funerals or in some times of drought to please the deity of rain. In the Gold Coast, deformed children were perceived as witches, bad omens, or God's punishment for sins of the ancestors, and so were burned alive, buried in dung heaps, or decapitated. Cutting and branding the skin, genital mutilation of boys and girls, and beatings were parts of rite of passage rituals. But the systemic ritualistic whooping of children as punishment for disobedience was generally not a part of West African cultures, given the spiritual beliefs about young people and their social value. And given the absence of physical brutality against slaves, it would make sense that children who were highly valued would not be harshly punished the way that they were later on southern plantations in America and other parts of the Atlantic world. A number of top historians of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in Africa told me that they had not come across any evidence of the kind of harsh physical punishment of children in West Africa that black parents and children were subjected to on African slave plantations. However, the historian Paul Lovejoy pointed me to a biographical accounts in which West Africans talked about being kidnapped because they disobeyed their parents. It is possible that the threat of physical discipline may have lurked in the background, Lovejoy wrote in an email. He also told me that historically, Kwarnak education of children involved whooping in some Islamic schools. The practice involved the teacher standing above the children, mostly boys, with a short whip as they sat on the ground citing verses in Arabic. If students mispronounced words, then they got a sharp snap of the whip. Lovejoy noted that this practice is still done today in some traditional Quranic schools. The biography of Mahoma Gardo Baquiqua, a Muslim who was kidnapped in Africa and brought to Brazil as a slave, then escaped New York City and wrote an autobiography described the nature of this practice in the 1830s and 1840s. To understand the evolution of violent parenting practices among African Americans requires us to look at slavery in West Africa before Europeans turned it into a horrific race based big business. Many slaves who were transported to America had been indentured servants in Africa, where the practice was an ancient and widespread institution not based on skin color. Africans did not enslave and sell people from their own ethnic or cultural group. This gave them the opportunity to readily sell prisoners of war and people they considered outsiders. The slavery that existed in Africa did not resemble the popular American image of gangs of black bodies on large plantation picking cotton in the hot sun under the constant threat of the whip. Slavery in Africa existed along a spectrum of dependence and servitude, and there was no strict boundary between the owed and unowned. Slaves occupied a wide range of roles and positions, and were often part of a family by adoption or marriage. They had the right to marry and to own and inherit property. Some were royal slaves, while other slaves owned slaves themselves. A child of a well-to-do slave might have a better life than a poor person living in the countryside. People sold themselves into slavery to pay off debts, or to avoid starvation, to gain belonging as members of kin networks, or because it gave them the opportunity to achieve power and prominence. Their status as slaves was not lifelong, and they could envision freedom for themselves in the future. In African societies, slaves represented human capital and were not property in the way they were on American plantations. Owning slaves wasn't primarily driven by the desire to accumulate money, but was part of efforts by powerful men to acquire more wives and children and access to land and to ensure protection from debt and abuse. Violence did have a role. In Africa, slaves were often, but not always, captured through kidnap and warfare, and some slaves, especially young men, were used for human sacrifice during religious or funeral rituals. Brutal whippings, though, were not considered an effective means to get slaves to do their jobs, which ranged from domestic work to soldiering to tax collection. In the popular 18th century, slave narratives from African born slaves, such as Otoba Gungo, who was snatched at age 13 while gathering fruit in the woods, Venture Smith, who was kidnapped at age 6 and brought to Connecticut, and Oluda Ikwayodo, who was kidnapped at age 11 and sold to British slavers who shipped them to Barbados, then Virginia, and Philadelphia. There's no evidence of physical punishment by their parents. In fact, all described having a happy childhood before being kidnapped, with parents who gave them great affection. Historians estimate that about 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World before 1866, and at least 2 million died during the Middle Passage. About one quarter of the slaves who crossed the Atlantic were children, defined as anyone shorter than 4 feet 4 inches. In the early phases of the slave trade, children were viewed as a bad investment, and adults were preferred for the brutal 40-day trip across the Atlantic. But by the late 18th century, increasing numbers of children had entered the slave trade. The reasons vary. A changing specialized market created a stronger demand in the West Indies for labor in coffee bean picking, for which children were better suited. Then there were families who sold their own children into slavery during times of drought and famine. The money from the sale enabled parents to purchase food, shelter, and other provisions for the rest of the family. The average age of slaves captives was between 15 and 20 at the beginning of the 19th century, but dropped to between 9 and 12 when abolition of the slave trade was imminent. When the Margarita sailed in 1734 with 93 Africans, 87% were under age 16, and the youngest being 10. In 1746, the Newport, Rhode Island merchant William Ellery wrote, "If you have good trade, purchase 40 or 50 Negroes. Get most of them mere boys and girls, some men, let them be young. No very small children." The New York City merchant John Watts wrote in 1762, "The younger the better, if not quite children. Those advanced in years will never do." When the Maria sailed in 1790, 90% of the 80 Africans on board were listed as children. The fact that the majority of captives were young is significant for our understanding of the evolution of African American child rearing practices. Bringing over mostly youth and mixing cultures meant that traditional African child rearing practices faded in the same way African languages and religious practices ultimately did. Had the slaves who crossed the Atlantic been mostly adults from the same tribes and nationalities, spoken the same languages, shared the same blueprint for child rearing that was followed in the societies they were to be enslaved in, and had been given freedom to rear their children without interference from whites, then maybe traditional African child rearing practices could have been preserved. But since none of those conditions prevailed, to argue that whipping children was brought over from Africa is simply false. Once on the slave ship, virtually every child was separated from his or her relatives because traders had no incentive to keep families together. Sometimes newborns were kept with their mothers, but it was not unusual for ship captains to throw babies overboard if they changed their minds about the purchase, or if the child's cries got annoying. But most young captives came without parents. Sexual exploitation of boys and girls was also common. In this environment, the kidnap, warfare, famine, death, and the increased capture of children, African adults responded by creating larger kinship networks to care for their young in the absence of parents. Over time, these networks developed new, harsher customs toward violence as a means of self preservation and safety. Sound familiar? So, as the Atlantic slave trade wore on, Africans on the continent of Africa felt more compelled to advance new, more rigid coping mechanisms for the hardships of life, which included the possibility of their children being captured and sold away to an unknown world. And Africans on the continent of America felt the full weight of human cruelty as they endured life on plantations. What united parents in Africa, North America, and other parts of the Atlantic world where millions of black people ended up was that they all wanted to give their children the best chances of survival, and they feared that they would not be able to adequately prepare their offspring for the dismal realities of their new environments. Slave children in America played a pivotal role in the grueling daily operation of plantations run by white planters who were obsessed with profit maximization. Unlike today, when black women are demonetized for producing children out of wedlock, plantation owners encouraged slave women to have lots of babies. This was especially crucial when the threat of abolition and the international slave trade threatened supplies of replacements from Africa. The new status of slave children as property owned by white people instead of their parents meant that their value had changed socially and spiritually. Being owned by racist white people also dramatically altered interactions between slave parents and children. Once in America, Africans had to reconfigure a meaningful way to raise children under slavery because they were denied many of the same rights and responsibilities granted to free families. As in Africa, enslaved parents in America continued to emphasize respect for elders, and they formed extended networks to share collective responsibility and to care for other people's children if a parent died or was sold. So it is fair to say that American slaves maintained some African practices and values, but were deeply shaped by European culture too. This created a new, unique African American culture. Two histories intersecting and blending together for 4 centuries is how we got to where we are. It would be an understatement to say that slavery denied black children a quality childhood. Faced with abuse and poor living conditions, hygiene, and diet, about half of all slave children did not survive the first decade of life. The mortality rate for black children was twice that of white children until about age 14. This meant that slave parents had to deal constantly with a devastating number of child deaths. For those children who survived the early years of life, parents then had the task of socializing them for the cruel realities of slavery, which included brutal whippings and torture, being loaned out as prostitutes, and the possibility of being sold away from their relatives for the rest of their lives. Be good and trust the Lord. Be polite, obey your new elders and masters. These were the messages slave parents had to whisper into their children's ears to prepare them for being parceled out to strangers. Owners sold kids when they needed cash to finance education for their own white children, to construct new homes, and for other minor purchases. One former slave from North Carolina recalled that his brother was sold to dress young misses for her wedding. Under these conditions, American slavery created a new kind of black parenting whereby mothers and fathers were denied legal guardianship of their young. Slave children belonged to the plantation elite, and the master's authority preempted parental authority. As one slave put it, during slavery, it seemed like your children belonged to everybody but you. Not only did slave parents have to worry about their children surviving, and completing the stages of childhood, but they also had to try to attach emotional meaning to their lives in a system that undermined family stability and parental authority. Owners punished slave children without parental consent and gave them work tasks that weren't age appropriate. Children watched their parents being whooped. They didn't only beat us, but they used to strap my mama to a bench or box and beat her with a wooden paddle while she was naked, one former slave recalled. Another said, "Many a day mama has stood by and watched massa beat her children till they bled, and she couldn't open her mouth." Since the productivity and obedience of enslaved workers was critical to the success of the plantation economy, abuse of physical punishment through the sting of the lash and other forms of torture was deemed a necessary part of daily life. Masters and overseers used the whip to enforce rules, to make slaves submissive, to break rebellious spirits, and to remind the entire enslaved plantations of the absolute power of white people. Children were not spared the pain of the whip either. They could be beaten for sassing a white person, slacking off, stealing, fighting, or breaking tools. And so it was in the context of slavery that black American adults and children were introduced to the ritualistic weapons with features that still show up in child punishments today. To be clear, not all of the physical cruelty meted out to slaves was driven by a profit motive. Plantation owners, drivers, and white women whipped and tortured slaves not only to instill deference and obedience, but also to vent their rage. Sarah Graves, a former Mississippi slave, recalled that her master whipped his slaves as a pastime, while another owner beat a slave because he could not recollect ever whooping him. Other forms of violence included the rankest sort: amputations, rapes, stabbings, shootings, brandings, and being savaged by dogs. This kind of sadistic violence was routine and often conducted in front of the entire slave community to teach a lesson to others. Slaves were often stripped naked and whipped with stitches and leather straps that tore open their flesh. Back then, whipping a child, whether done by depraved whites or black overseers, was a way to get that child accustomed to the reality that he or she had little power over his or her life. The mere threat of a whipping was a round the clock reminder to be obedient and to work without complaint. Slaves were to be seen and not heard unless called upon. It's not a coincidence that reading these kinds of narratives invokes memories of some of our own childhoods. Enslaved parents were under tremendous pressure to make their children into docile field workers. As the historian Marie Jenkins Swartz notes in her book, Born in Bondage, white owners recognized the influence slave parents had over their sons and daughters, and so they urged them to subdue children and turn them into dutiful and submissive servants. White owners and slave parents punished kids for different reasons. Slaveholders chastised children for their own convenience or benefit, while enslaved parents did so out of genuine concern for their welfare. Enslaved parents were also required to teach children proper deference and demeanor in front of whites. Staring at white people, rolling eyes, sucking teeth, talking back, and questioning authority put children at risk for being whooped or sold. In her book, Stolen Childhood, the historian Wilma King highlights an 1854 issue of the journal Southern Planter, which gave instructions to overseers about training slave children. Slave children were to be taught not to run and hide from whites, but to stand their ground and speak when spoken to in a polite manner. Polite slaves, as King notes, were expected to approach whites with bowed heads, downcast eyes, and hushed voices. Children who failed to keep up with their work tasks were whipped by whites and their parents. Swartz wrote about a 5-year-old Virginia slave named Katie Blackwell, who was whipped for not turning oxen in the right direction. One Alabama slave child's mother taught him to pick cotton by hitting him with a pole when he didn't follow her directions. Because the disciplinary measures employed by slaves generally pleased owners, slave parents retained most of the responsibility for disciplining their children, and they often defended their right to physically discipline children without intrusion by whites because they believed a whipping at their hands was better than one from a white person. The right to beat a black child is a sacrosanct privilege handed down to black parents from slavery, the only privilege they got from their white masters. The historical archives are full of awful narrative of slave adults and children being whipped and tortured. There are images of slaves strung up in distorted postures, hands tied with ropes, victims writhing in agony, bleeding, convulsing, crying, and hollering for mercy. There are gory images of skin stripped off the body from whips. Eyes are blinded, ears cropped, cheeks gashed out, jaws broken, teeth knocked out, heads cracked. Pregnant women whipped so hard they miscarried right at the whipping post. There are testimonies involving infants whipped to death by white women just for crying. And there are stories of slaves being awakened from their sleep at night and whipped for failing to complete tasks. The Reverend Horace Moulton, a Methodist minister, wrote, I have often heard the sound of the lash, the curses of the whipper, and the cries of the poor Negro rending the air, late in the evening, and long before daylight in the morning. And generations later, you can hear black folks tell funny stories about being snatched out of bed and whipped on the spot for forgetting to take the trash out or for not completing some other chore. I will spare you further depictions of the graphic violence against black bodies on the plantation because we are presently living in a culture where scenes of black brutality and death play a constant loop. But we must acknowledge that whooping black people was always about asserting power and control, whether it was done by slave masters or black parents. After slaves were emancipated in 1865, the rules of racial etiquette and the ritualistic whippings continued as a new kind of coercive labor system emerged that depended on black child workers. Once again, whites co opted black parenting to make sure it performed the same kind of function in freedom as it had done during slavery. With sanctioning from the black church of all places, black parents became extensions of the master's lash in order to instill unquestioning obedience to the rules of the Jim Crow system. Their reasoning was simple: to prepare black children to deal with the chronic stresses they would face and to keep them alive.